All right, best practices in the field or from the field that we need to incorporate into our policies. Okay, best practices, bit of an introduction. Obviously, over time, best practices for museums and archives has evolved. And specifically, there's been some evolution around COVID-19 global pandemic, some of the hardships that incurred, specifically financial hardships on the part of archives and museums and their organizations needing to close, impact to financial streams, etc. And that triggering specifically a loosening in the restrictions for the American Alliance of Museums and the Association of Art Museum Directors, both of which had a code of ethics around when one could consider selling artwork, and if you did, what those proceeds were allowed to go to. Beforehand, before COVID, it was only allowed to fund the purchase of new art. During COVID, it loosened to include money to go towards collections care, and I believe loosened up enough and had flexibility towards that could include staff in charge of collections care and some major flexibility around some potential temporary operations kind of funding. Now that we're sort of through the worst of it, so to speak, economically for the COVID-19 pandemic, the restrictions have come back to still allowing money for collections care, but it's very much restricted and frowned upon to use the funds for staff, even if it is for collections care, in addition to not operations for reasons we touched on a little earlier in terms of if you're operating a museum, it needs to be financially sustainable and you can't continue to sell your collection because you will eventually run out of your collection. Plus, also, isn't it your job to keep the collection kind of stuff? So, um, orientation and context for like where it started, how it changed, some of the change back. It very much includes the concept of the public trust. So again, even though there are no laws, so to speak, saying that for all of the collections in museums and archives that they belong to the public or that there is this beholdenness in a legal sense to the public. However, because of the nature of museums and archives, and typically they are nonprofit and public serving organizations, there is that concept of them performing work and within the public trust. Also, we must take into account the state and federal laws. So like the very literal laws that could apply in a federal sense, I'm meaning mostly like if you are selling art, especially if you're in a museum that is selling millions of dollars worth of art, there are tax implications depending on what and how with the money managed, etc. Which is why sometimes you see headlines with the FBI being involved with a federal level investigation regarding museums selling art. State laws are more toward, typically I'm thinking like more the abandoned property and needing to make sure that you've waited the requisite amount of time according to your state and its laws on when property is considered officially abandoned and you can get rid of it if you do not have any sort of paperwork or paper trail indicating that the object was donated or gifted or whatever to you. Finally, best practices are built to avoid triggering those federal level issues for those tax exempt organizations, and for the most part, including some of those state level laws. And I would add best practices, especially those that are used as guidelines or handed down by the professional organizations, to also include the ethical things that museums and archives have to sort of grapple with or make their way through when we are talking about deaccessioning parts of our collections and when we are considering different disposal methods, some of which include generating revenue. Speaking of which, So I mentioned we started out super restrictive. On the left-hand side was a previous art museum, the Association of Art Museum Directors stance. I think this one was from 2011, and very clearly stating that the highlighted section, deaccessions only to acquire other works of art. Proceeds are never to be used for operating funds. And then coming out, and you'll notice this is 2022, AAMD and now AAM have aligned into like a mutual agreement on policy where when you read the larger press statement, it is that swinging back to only to acquire new art, and then some very specificness around like, yeah, maybe also collections care. And if you have more questions about ethics and about the sale, like selling of objects specifically, including concepts of public trust and public good, AAM does have basically like a Q&A blog post that is pretty helpful on most of the questions you could possibly have on this particular area of the subject. So please go check that out. Of course, they have several other resources on ethics. I did check for this particular link, and you can access this Q&A without it being behind the AAM paywall.